Well, one of the things my mother told me when I was finishing high school, and she said, well, you were the only one we didn't have to get a lawyer for. And it's true, I was the only one they didn't. One of my siblings was engaged in some sort of petty criminality and needed a lawyer. And two of my siblings were involved in lawsuits, one as a plaintiff, one as a defendant for personal injury that had happened. There's a lot of it through teenage stupidity, as we know that happens. But she said, you're the only one we didn't need a lawyer for. And we know that when injury happens, we need to have some way to deal with it, and this is why we have laws and lawsuits. And I could even say, who here has been sued? You don't have to raise your hands. Who here has sued someone? Who here has had some injury that they need to redress through the law? And if you look at the Bible, you even have people who, when they think about their lives, they go, I'm going to sue God. Someone like Job. That's essentially what he says. He goes, I want to go to the highest court, and I want to present my case. And thank God Job did that, because then for the rest of us, we go, well, that wasn't a very good idea, you know. But it actually works the other way, too. Sometimes God sues us, and we don't necessarily think about it in that way, but that's exactly what's happening in Micah. God brings a suit against us. And so this reading from Micah, it happens in Isaiah and other places. Unfortunately, this isn't the only time that God has had to sue his people. But there is a covenantal relationship that has been violated, and that violation requires some kind of redress so that the injury can be dealt with. Now, I was working with a nonprofit for special needs adults, and they were caught up in a lawsuit over some obscure California labor law. If anyone knows PAGA lawsuits, that's a whole other conversation. But, you know, we went into the settlement conference, and they go, okay, we want $12 million. And this nonprofit laughed, saying, we don't have $12 million, we'll give you $100,000. And then they laughed. And then the whole work of settlement is trying to find some place where each of you has to take a little bit of pain, but you're going to agree and say, we'll put this thing away so that we can move on and say the injury has been dealt with. And this is essentially what God is doing. God says, I'm suing you. And of course, when God sues you, usually the case is pretty tightly wrapped. You know, not a lot of loose ends in that lawsuit. And you don't have a jury of your peers, because all your peers are part of the suit. So creation itself becomes the jury. This is why God summons the creation, other created things, mountains, birds, things that witness to human unfaithfulness, infidelity. So just because the ocean doesn't speak to us doesn't mean the ocean isn't watching. Just because the mountains don't speak to us doesn't mean that if God calls them to say, what did you see them do, that they will report to the one who made them. This is how we saw them be unfaithful. Now, this section of Micah is a very, very short lawsuit, because I think immediately the people go into settlement mode, and they go, okay, well, what's it going to take? 10,000 rams? How many gallons of olive oil? How much do you want, God, so we can make this thing go away? And then they even say, should we sacrifice our children to you? God goes, oh, no, not that, none of that. You'll notice that God doesn't counter and go, oh, yeah, you think 10,000 rams, how about 500,000 rams? Well, we can't do that. Well, how about... We could go back, forth, back, forth, back, forth. God isn't interested in the rams, the oil, or some insane sacrifice of children. Part of the problem is God doesn't need any of that. You know, so God's not like, well, I'm going to take some punitive damages, and I will take more of your rams than I was injured for, because this is the violation of communion. It is the violation of a relationship. And God says, you know what I want to settle this lawsuit? I don't want your rams. I don't want your oil. I want you to do three things. I want you to love justice, or do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with me. And you can imagine that when those terms get brought to the settlement table, people go, are you sure you don't want the rams? Or maybe the oil. Because what God is not willing to do is let our religious theater somehow substitute for a holy life where God is our God and we will be God's people. And this is the fundamental covenantal relationship of the Old Testament, where it says, this is the deal. and it's compared to a marriage. I will be your husband, you will be my wife, God says to them. So you'll also see God initiate divorce proceedings against the people in some of the prophetic books. Unfortunately, if you have some chaotic people in your life, you might be going back to court more than once because of them. God has to do that with his people. But God is not looking to extract punitive damages out of us, as people have said. What God is looking for is purgative restoration. I will cleanse you, I will restore you, I will make you whole. I want you to be the people I made you to be, and I want your worship to match your character. So, justice, kindness, humility before God, those three things will become enough for us to dismiss the lawsuit. Then the mountains can go back to being mountains, the oceans can go back to being oceans. They're like, thank God, jury duty's over. If you thought you didn't like jury duty, imagine the San Gabriel Mountains going, oh, I don't want jury duty this week against God's people. And it's the invitation to fidelity. And it's the invitation for God to show up and be God. And when God shows up to be God, then we can be God's people. This is how we get to the Gospel of Matthew this morning. And it's how we get to the Beatitudes, because we know that God did something rather unusual. God didn't just leave us with this legal system. God actually came and became both the plaintiff and the defendant, the Father and the Son. God takes both sides of the lawsuit moving forward through the incarnation of Jesus, which means Jesus becomes the person who does the three things that no one else is willing to do. Namely, I will live out my existence as a faithful human being. My faith and my religion won't just be some sort of superficial addition to the life that I want to live by my self-determination. And Jesus shows us a new way forward, which is the way of blessing. And that's why when Jesus gives his first major speech in the Gospel of Matthew, everything that God does is bless. You'll notice that it's God is understood as the subject of blessing, the giver of blessing. And it's precisely the circumstances in which God finds his people where God only brings blessing. You'll notice Jesus doesn't say, well, blessed are the poor in heart, but, well, if you're not poor of heart, you're not really blessed. Well, actually, here's some terms and conditions where you have been exempted from the blessing. And when you go, oh my gosh, I'm going to be blessed by God. And they go, well, if you look at the fine print, actually, you're not going to be blessed by God. But we needed to do that for the marketing. Sorry, that was a marketing campaign. But if you look at the fine print, no, every situation, poverty of heart, mourning, all of that, God only shows up with blessing. Because God's intention is that human beings have fullness of life. And so when you think of on the list of things that God brings blessing to, it's all injury. It's all poverty, it's all emptiness, it's all violence. This is the world that God finds us living in. You already know that world. We prayed for Minneapolis last week, and we have someone from Minneapolis here who had even requested that prayer the week before. That violence, God brings blessing. The poverty of heart, like I told you in the video this week, that we got an interesting call. We haven't gotten this call before. In the last few months now, we've been helpers of two stories that appeared on the news, and this last one was not very good. Toyota of Huntington Beach called, and they've been a longtime funder of our social ministry. They were some of the early seed money of our work with the homeless in Huntington Beach, and because of your generosity, actually, you replaced what they were giving, and that money has been used for another purpose. But they said, we're dealing with a family, not in Huntington Beach, but another one of our dealerships. And it was a horrific story on the news. Basically, a parent who abused their daughters in the worst possible way you could. And the one had become homeless, and they were trying to put her into a house, and it was a difficult situation. They said, but if the church would work with us, we can double and triple your gift to make sure that this young woman who has been horribly abused, and bad enough that it was on the news, she can have an apartment, she can be safe for a year. We want to get her stabilized for a year so that she can return to wholeness. That is blessing in the middle of hardship. Blessing in the middle of violence and violation. God's answer, and the answer to the church, or from the church, was yes. We want to be part of returning someone to wholeness. And this is precisely why we do the social ministry we do, but it's also why each of us has to take seriously God inviting us to wholeness too. God wants to bring you to a place where you experience on every one of those places of poverty, of lack, of violence, of faithlessness, of hardship, that Jesus is going to show up and say, you're blessed. This is a blessing. The church does not need to be a place that is punishing or shaming or humiliating. The church is meant to be that place that loves justice, loves kindness, walks humbly with God, and everything we do, even when there has been violation and the need for legal recourse that must be taken seriously, we are folding it into the promise of redemption and resurrection. Not justifying sin. Oh, it's okay, because it's not okay. It's genuinely damaging. Not justifying sin, but justifying sinners. Taking people and having them appear before God and having them be made whole. Why did God sue the people in Micah? Because God refused to leave people without blessing. God refused to leave people in their poverty of heart, in their mourning, in their persecution, in their hunger for a world that's different than the world we have today. God refused to leave us there so that we could be full, and in that fullness walk toward everlasting life. Amen.